2013 was the bloodiest year since 2008. Bombings, shootings, death. And just 2 years after U.S. troops pulled out, Al-Qaeda is battling for control again in the notorious Anbar province. It's an all too familiar story for a country gripped by conflict since 2003. We begin with this report from John Gilmore.
It began with shock and awe. March 2003, a massive U.S.-led attack on Iraq was launched. Within weeks, the government of Saddam Hussein was toppled. Soon, the message was, mission accomplished.
Have prevailed.
Then, in December 2003, Saddam Hussein was captured and later executed. But the Iraq insurgency was raging. Al-Qaeda was now in the fight. And in one of the bloodiest battles of the war, U.S., Iraqi, and British forces won control of Fallujah in late 2004. Despite elections and promises of unity government, the sectarian war dragged on and the casualties mounted. And while there was military success with the so-called surge in 2007, at home, Americans and their coalition allies were losing interest in the mission. Barack Obama won election in 2008, promising to bring American troops home. And in December 2011, the U.S. finally pulled out. But just over 2 years later, the war is boiling over again. The death toll in 2013 topped 8,000. A resurgent Al-Qaeda, now calling itself ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, is back in force in Anbar province. Capitalizing on the war next door in Syria, the Al-Qaeda fighters are driving the chaos again. And this time, U.S. troops will not be in the fight.
This is a fight that belongs to the Iraqis. That is exactly what the president and the world decided some time ago when we left Iraq. So we are not obviously contemplating returning. We're not contemplating putting boots on the ground. This is their fight. But we're going to help them in their fight.
Meanwhile, the Shia-led government of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki is also under attack. He's blamed for a failure to deal effectively with the minority Sunni population. And there's genuine concern that with elections coming up in April, the sectarian conflict could spin out of control. The cost of the Iraq war has been massive. More than 100,000 Iraqi civilians have been killed. And there have been more than 4,700 U.S. and allied troop deaths. The price to the U.S. for it all? Conservative estimates begin at $1 trillion. And one other figure, 0. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found. Was it all worth it? And what happens now as the daily bloodshed continues? John Gilmore, CCTV, Washington.
Joining me now from Baghdad is Mowaffak Al-Rubaie. He is a former national security advisor in Iraq, and in that role, he oversaw the execution of Saddam Hussein. We want to welcome you to the broadcast. Thanks so much for joining us. Given that you were there, oversaw that moment in time, did you ever think that years later I'd be sitting here interviewing you about a huge spike in violence and deaths in Iraq?
Well, we did expect this to happen because there is no direct correlation between the execution of Saddam Hussein and the surge of violence. The surge of violence now in Iraq in the last couple of years is of multifactorial reason. Number one is the civil war in the next door neighbor, Syria, which is spilling over across the borders to Iraq. Number two is the sectarian polarization in the region. We have the Iran versus Saudi, Shia versus Sunni. This is that polarization, the sectarian polarization is really translated into blood in our street in Baghdad. And some of the GCC countries, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, are directly helping Al-Qaeda and the Takfiris, the terrorists in Iraq and in neighboring Syria. But let's forget about the Syria for the time being. Let's concentrate on Iraq. There are men from the GCC country. There are funds coming from the GCC country. There are political and media support coming from the GCC country. So I honestly believe that until and unless these people stop helping the terrorists inside Iraq, this is going to reverse migration, I call it. It will come back to them and it will bite them back very, very soon, and I mean that.
The perception is Iraq is spinning out of control. You would say that that's not the case.
And I honestly believe that the government of Iraq is having the upper hand. They are winning. They are prevailing in Al-Anbar, and they have a full comprehensive package of measures. Number one is
Mr. Al-Rubaie, let me interrupt for just a minute. You say that they have the upper hand, but we're almost seeing daily doses of bombings at funerals. We're seeing them at police stations, markets. Do you think the Iraqi people would agree with you?
They would, because if you come to this country from probably far away, the perception, as you said, is reality, but it's not reality on the ground. The Iraqi security forces is in full control of most of the province of Al-Anbar, and they regain probably 90% of the territory of Al-Anbar province. We're talking about Al-Fallujah, the Fallujah city, which is probably 250,000 population, and we have a very clear idea what to do with Fallujah. Today, we are in the process of encouraging the civilians to leave Fallujah, so that when the government of Iraq and the Iraqi security forces launch the military operation, they will not be there. There will no civilian will be there in Fallujah. And then after that, we will go with the humanitarian aids. Then we will go with the highly selective targets by the counter-terrorism forces and SWAT forces. And after loosening that, the army will go inside the Fallujah and clean it. And then we will start the process of reconstruction of what the Al-Qaeda has destroyed of this beautiful city, of the sacred city for the Sunni Arab community. And after that, we will go for a full comprehensive measures of national reconciliation, including awakening, including the Sunni Arab inclusion in the federal government. So it's the whole holistic approach of it.
Well, let me ask you, you bring up inclusion. Let me interrupt for just a minute. You bring up inclusion, and yet that's been one of the major complaints about Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, is that he's Shia and that there hasn't been a lot of inclusion, that he's treating the Sunnis as second-class citizens. And really, that's actually perhaps going to lead to even more sectarian violence. How would you address that complaint?
Let me go back to 2006 and 2007. We have what do I call a treatment of choice, which is the national reconciliation, awakening, including the Sunni Arabs inside the local government and the central government. So this is a very clear measures. We have tried, tested, and we were successful in that. Now, this is going to be repeated now, and I'm sure it's going to succeed. I can tell you, Iraqi security forces will prevail, and will prevail very soon.
Briefly, because we're out of time, but I want to ask, do you think the Prime Minister, would you urge him to work more closely with the Sunnis? Can he patch up these differences?
I have no shadow of doubt that the closer we work with the Sunni Arabs in the western provinces, the better. The more we include them in the federal government, the better. The more of the awakening and sons of Iraq and recruit their young people into the Iraqi security forces, into the local police, into the federal police, into the city counter-terrorism, the better. So it is, and also injecting cash in the local economy to generate revenue, local revenue, and to encourage the local economy, as well as to generate new jobs for the unemployed. It's a holistic approach the government of Iraq is taking.
Mowaffak Al-Rubaie, thank you so much for joining us. Certainly appreciate it.